Alright, so hello everybody. I know this isn't conventional, but I've been trying to get my computer to screen record and it won't. So we're going to use this as a nice little voiceover. It's going to be in the form of a YouTube video. If you want to play it while you're looking at the presentation, feel free. That is the goal here, but this is going to be my presentation of my research paper, which looks into measuring the internal processes that we have as humans cognitively by looking at our behaviors. So to start with a little introduction, there's a lot of topics within the cognitive psychology world and the normal psychology world that are measured with behaviors. We think something and then we end up doing it. Due to this, it's really hard to measure things without looking at behaviors. We prefer looking at behaviors in order to measure certain things that are going on in our heads cognitively. Without these behaviors, it can get really difficult to understand certain things that are going on cognitively in our heads, such as whether we have attention on something or whether we're remembering something at that moment. It can be very hard to tell without specific behaviors being drawn out from that cognitive function. Therefore, it can make it very difficult to validate certain cognitive behaviors and certain cognitive functions within our minds without directly seeing them. So let's say I have my attention on something, but I'm not acting any different. It's going to be incredibly difficult for you to be able to tell that there's something going on in my head. Therefore, this presentation is going to look into a lot of different aspects of research that discuss how we take cognitive psychology and measure it by behavior, or how we attempt to measure things cognitively, but because we can't see them, it might be hard to validate them. So starting with my literature review, if you want to switch to the next slide, there's a lot of research that has to do with cognitive psychology and areas where behavior is a key factor in order to find measurements other than just looking at what's on a paper or what's going on inside our heads, which is something we typically can't see. So, the first article that I found discusses health choices and how health choices give us a decent input on how our cognitive behavior can be shown in actual behavior. A basic hypnosis of this looks into the idea that if we consciously make a healthy choice that we have been thinking about or are thinking about, then we're going to act on that. We're going to end up using that behavior and that thought to make a healthy choice. We act out what we are cognitively thinking as a whole, and it shows in data in everyday situations that behavior is drawn from cognitive processes, and that is something we can see, and that is something we can easily validate and measure. Then we move on to the second article, which looks at an experimental research study regarding how individuals act to several different stimuluses, but the main independent variable is whether or not they are aware that the stimuluses are coming or not. So in this research study, it can be seen that individuals who were aware of the stimulus being there acted differently compared to those who were unaware of the stimulus being there, which is slightly obvious. You're going to act different if you're aware that something's coming at you than if you were unaware that something was coming at you. This shows that perception and cognition can play a major role in how we behave as a whole. Because if you're thinking that something is there and it's not, you're going to act different. And again, if you know something is there and it is, you're going to be aware of it and you're going to understand that you're not going to act on that, which is again something that we can measure cognitively and behaviorally. It comes out with our behavior. This is another thing, another one of those invisible processes in our mind that can be incredibly hard to measure without specific aspects of behavior. Looking into the third article, which is on the next slide if you want to switch to it. The third article looks into educational testing as a form of cognition-based testing with results without any specific behaviors involved. So this was essentially just take a bunch of people, have them take an educational test, look at their intelligence, which intelligence is a cognitive process. Therefore, this is a cognitive process that we are able to look into specifically and validate without specific behaviors being involved. It's not somebody reacting to something, it's simply somebody taking a test and understanding what's going on in that test so we can measure their intelligence levels. So this is one of the several examples of how it is possible to measure without behavior, but it can be incredibly difficult to handle other aspects of cognitive psychology without behavior. Then we come to Article 4. Article 4 discusses variations regarding measurements of behavior and just plain cognition levels. Now, there's some studies where behavior is involved, and there's some studies where just cognitive processing is involved that we can measure without behavior, but there seems to be a great deal of variation between these studies. Now, what does this essentially mean? This essentially means that with this variation, there's a great deal of unvalid results because it's so varied, but it could be, let's say something's measuring someone's intelligence. You can take a test for that, but you can also behave on that. And the behavior might be different than what you'd be thinking in your mind, which is something that we can't instantaneously see. Therefore, we can't instantaneously measure it. And this is incredibly difficult to see because the variation could cause several aspects of invalidated studies or conflicting results between studies, which is something very important to look into. The final article that we're going to be looking at is the idea that humans have processing systems that establish specific behaviors, specifically goal-relevant and goal-irrelevant behaviors. So if you set your mind to something and you have a goal on something, you're going to act upon that. As well, if you're avoiding a goal, you're going to act on avoiding it, essentially. So you're not going to want to establish certain behaviors that wouldn't get you to where you want to be. Now, this is all a form of us thinking. This is us thinking about this. We have to understand in our minds, but nobody can measure what exactly we are thinking. All they can measure is the behavior that we put forth, which can cause some issues, again, with understanding some aspects of cognitive psychology. So, next slide. What does this mean discussion-wise? Well, there's a lot of different research on this topic. There's a great deal of research with a lot of different methodologies that have been used, such as meta-analysis, survey and test-based research, and experimental research. Now, all of these are really useful for understanding how we can measure these processes that are going on in our minds. But it kind of begs the question, what does this essentially mean for cognitive psychology research? So at the end of the day, next slide, by the way, I believe the best course of action for future research regarding this problem within cognitive psychology would be to start with a meta-analysis, going back, looking at all the data that could be humanly crafted and made, all the studies, all the summaries, everything, a lot of stuff that has been published, and understanding how these two concepts can be measured equally and validated equally without just behavior being one measure and just the internal process being another measure, because it can be really difficult to look at these internal processes without the behavior being involved. If the behavior isn't involved, it becomes incredibly difficult to look into just how much is going on inside of someone's head. And sometimes people don't act on everything that they're thinking. Sometimes they act differently. Sometimes they act irrationally, impulsively. There's so many different conflicting things that go into behavior that show behavior sometimes isn't as grounded as it may seem to be. After a meta-analysis of previous and more modern day research on this topic, I believe then would be a good idea to start research studies, maybe some survey and test-based studies to get a broader understanding of this as a whole. In conclusion, next slide, these internal processes can be hard to measure, such as attention and memory. Memory, you'll remember things and you can recall different things, but attention might be incredibly hard to show without acting out on it. And without acting out on it, you would never know if somebody's paying attention or not, or how their attention is fixated on something, or why. You would never know without that behavior. Behaviors are incredibly important, especially for a topic such as this. They can be easily measured and easily validated if multiple people are doing it. Future research and past research are both important to understandably measure these processes and validate them better than they were before. And I believe it will be possible at some point to understand what's going on inside the mind without looking at identifying behaviors beforehand. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you for listening. I am sorry this was unconventional because it's just going to be me looking at a screen and you looking at a presentation, but I am trying my best, and thank you.